It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in the village of St. Mary's Hollow. The scent of fresh-cut grass mingled with the earthy perfume of damp wood as the sun peeked through the heavy clouds, casting a soft golden glow over the cobblestone streets. The village square, bordered by quaint cottages with thatched roofs, bustled in its own serene way, the hum of daily life floating on the breeze. In the corner of the square stood the old bookshop, Jillian's Corner, a relic of another time. The shop was small, tucked between the post office and a tea shop that always smelled faintly of lavender. The windows were fogged with age, the paint on the sign chipped, but it was still a haven for anyone who appreciated the written word. Books, old and new, stacked high in leaning towers inside the dimly lit space. A fire crackled lazily in the corner, and a cat, grey with a soft, thick coat, lay stretched out on the counter as if guarding the literary treasures of the shop. Miss Marple had been a frequent visitor to the shop for years. She'd often find herself wandering in, simply to browse the shelves, her sharp eyes scanning the spines of the books, like a careful collector sifting through a box of jewels. Today was no different. She entered the bookshop, her umbrella dripping with the rain that had started to fall lightly. She was greeted by the soft, familiar voice of Jillian, the shop's owner, a pleasant woman in her late 50s, with a fondness for gardening and an almost unnatural attachment to the shop. "Miss Marple, what a delight to see you today," Jillian called from behind the counter, adjusting her glasses as she peered over at the older woman. Miss Marple smiled, with the slight lines around her eyes deepening. "Good afternoon, Jillian. I was hoping to find something new, perhaps something on the history of this village, if you have any." Jillian nodded, rising to her feet. "Of course. There's always something new to discover about St. Mary's Hollow, isn't there?" As Jillian walked toward a shelf at the far end of the room, Miss Marple took a moment to observe the shop. The usual clatter of voices from the market square outside had quieted, but the peaceful stillness of the place did little to mask the subtle tension hanging in the air. There was something faintly off about the afternoon, an unease that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. But it sat at the back of her mind like a shadow that didn't belong. Her gaze shifted to the front counter, where a young man stood, flicking through a book in silence. But he was new to the village, or at least Miss Marple had never seen him before. He had sharp features, dark eyes, and a nervous energy about him, as if he were waiting for something or someone. He didn't seem to notice Miss Marple's scrutiny, too engrossed in the book in his hands. A rare thing to be so absorbed in a book, Miss Marple thought, even rarer for someone so young. The bell above the door jingled, and another figure stepped into the shop. This one was familiar, Mrs. Henshaw, the village gossip. She had a way of entering a room that made it seem as though the entire building sighed with relief, as if it had been holding its breath. Today, however, her usual chirpy manner seemed absent. Her eyes darted about nervously, as if she were looking for something or someone. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Henshaw said with a forced smile, as though her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "I didn't expect to see you here. Lovely day, isn't it?" "It's quite peaceful," Miss Marple replied, but her eyes never left Mrs. Henshaw's face. The woman was hiding something. That much was clear. A woman who talked as much as Mrs. Henshaw often gave herself away in her own words. But today she was quieter than usual, and that was what caught Miss Marple's attention. Jillian returned with a small, leather-bound book in hand, "I thought you might enjoy this," she said, handing it to Miss Marple. The title was obscured by a layer of dust. Miss Marple wiped it away with the back of her hand and glanced at the cover. The History of St. Mary's Hollow. A Personal Account. Miss Marple took the book, her fingers brushing over the spine. There was something oddly familiar about it, as though she couldn't place why. It was a book she could have sworn she had seen before. But where? She gave it a cursory glance, then turned back to the counter where the young man and Mrs. Henshaw were now engaged in conversation, their voices low and urgent. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a brief flash of a document the young man had placed on the counter. A letter. His hand had instinctively moved to cover it, but the movement had been too quick, too defensive. Miss Marple didn't need to ask what it was. She already knew. Jillian followed Miss Marple's gaze. "Ah, yes, Mr. Morgan," she said, her tone just a little too bright. "He's new to the village, as I'm sure you've noticed. A rather quiet fellow. But then, we all know how people can be when they first arrive here." Miss Marple didn't reply, as she was too focused on the subtle exchange between the two at the counter. The letter Mr. Morgan had tried to hide was important. It wasn't just a piece of paper. Something told Miss Marple it was far more than that. "Have you heard about the old murder?" Mrs. Henshaw whispered suddenly, leaning toward Miss Marple as though it were a secret. Miss Marple's interest piqued, and she straightened. "What murder?" she asked casually, though she already knew there would be something more to it than just another village gossip. "Well, it's been years," Mrs. Henshaw began, lowering her voice even further. "But someone says they saw something strange happening at the old bookshop, just before Mr. Jillian took over. The police were involved, but it was all swept under the rug, you know. People talk, Miss Marple, and they always do." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already working through the possibilities. She turned toward the counter again, her gaze flicking from the young man to Mrs. Henshaw, and back to the letter hidden beneath his fingers. The pieces were slowly beginning to fall into place. Something was amiss in St. Mary's Hollow. A quiet murder had been overlooked, its memory buried under layers of time and gossip. But now, the past was resurfacing, and Miss Marple's mind began to unravel the mystery that had been left untouched for far too long. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain, tapping against the window panes of Jillian's corner. Miss Marple stood by the counter, the leather-bound book still clutched in her hands, though her attention was no longer on the title. Her mind was elsewhere, skimming the surface of conversations, of body language and hidden messages. The village was full of secrets, each one as well guarded as the last. But some, she suspected, were about to be unearthed. As Jillian continued her cheerful chatter with Mrs. Henshaw, Miss Marple took a slow step toward the front door. She had been around long enough to know when it was time to leave a scene behind. Sometimes a quiet retreat was more telling than any words spoken aloud. "Goodbye, Jillian. Mrs. Henshaw." Miss Marple nodded, slipping out into the wet afternoon. The rain had softened the sharpness of the village, turning the cobblestones into a shimmering expanse, reflecting the dull sky above. Outside, the village felt alive with subtle whispers, but the streets were still empty of life, save for the occasional passer-by, their collars turned up against the weather. Miss Marple's sharp gaze swept across the square, taking in the familiar sights. The old church loomed in the distance, its spire cutting into the grey sky, and beyond it, the row of cottages, their windows glowing faintly, a picture of domestic tranquility. Yet Miss Marple's mind remained firmly fixed on the letter she had glimpsed in Mr. Morgan's hands. That letter was more than a mere scrap of paper. It was a silent witness to something far darker. She took the narrow lane behind the bookshop, the one that led to the old vicarage. The path was lined with wildflowers, now bowed under the weight of the rain, their petals drooping as if in resignation. A few steps further she paused, noting the small garden shed at the end of the lane. It was a structure she had walked by countless times, yet today it seemed different, as if something hidden there was waiting to be discovered. Miss Marple hesitated, then decided against it. She would not press forward blindly. Her observations required a careful pace, a delicate balance between instinct and patience. For now, she needed to return to her cottage and let the threads of the mystery spin themselves out in her mind. At the edge of the village, tucked between the trees and obscured by a thicket of ivy, stood Miss Marple's cottage. It was a modest place, with a thatched roof and small whitewashed walls, but it was home. Inside, the familiar scent of lavender and polished wood greeted her. She hung her umbrella by the door, then took a seat in her favourite armchair by the fireplace. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the room. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of stillness. It was in these quiet moments that the pieces of the puzzle would often come together. She had learned to trust the subtle hints that tugged at her, the barely perceptible movements of memory and thought that led to clarity. Her thoughts turned back to Mr. Morgan. His defensiveness was unmistakable, and that was no accident. He had something to hide. But what? And why was he so intent on keeping the letter hidden? Miss Marple reached for the small desk drawer and pulled out a notebook, flipping through pages filled with her observations. She had learned long ago that the smallest details often held the key to unlocking the most complex mysteries. The letter, Mr. Morgan's reaction, the whispers from Mrs. Henshaw, each one added a layer to the story. As the evening shadows deepened, Miss Marple found herself lost in thought, and the stillness of the cottage broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the rain had slowed, leaving droplets to trace paths down the glass. Outside, the village remained as quiet as ever, the night settling in with an almost oppressive silence. But beneath the surface, Miss Marple knew that things were changing. She rose from her chair, a sudden determination filling her. There was more to the old bookshop than met the eye. She had sensed it earlier, that faint undercurrent of something amiss. She was not one for coincidences, and the letter was no mere oversight. It had been intentionally placed in her path. It was time to visit the bookshop once more. Only this time she would not leave until she had uncovered what had been hidden there for so long. The rain had stopped by the time Miss Marple made her way back to Jillian's corner. The shop's sign swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the glow of the lights within cast a welcoming, warm hue onto the cobblestones. As she entered, the familiar scent of old paper and ink filled her senses. Jillian was behind the counter again, this time organising a stack of new arrivals. "Miss Marple, back so soon?" she asked with a smile. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the shop. The young man, Mr. Morgan, was nowhere to be seen. Only the cat lay stretched out on the counter, its amber eyes flicking toward Miss Marple with a lazy curiosity. "I just came to ask about a particular book," Miss Marple said, her voice casual but laced with intent. Jillian raised an eyebrow, glancing at the shelves. "A book? I'm afraid I don't know which one you mean. We've had a few new things come in today." "It's an old book," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. "Perhaps from a few months ago. It seems important, more than a mere piece of history." Jillian looked at her curiously but gave nothing away. "I'm sure I could help you find it. We've quite a few old books that have been hidden away. They're not all easily found." Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Her gaze swept the room once more, taking in the scattered piles, the half-filled shelves, the objects that had been left behind in haste. Everything was exactly where it had been before. Nothing had changed, except the letter. She was sure of it now. Whatever the young man had hidden, it was still within these walls. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, a subtle glint of resolve in them. "I think I'll look around a bit more," she said softly, her voice firm with quiet determination. She turned, her footsteps deliberate as she moved deeper into the shop. There was something in the air tonight, and Miss Marple was certain she would uncover it, piece by piece, until the truth was finally revealed. The bell above the door jingled softly as Miss Marple stepped further into the bookshop. The dimly lit interior seemed unchanged from her last visit, save for the subtle shift in the air, as though the very space itself had absorbed the tension she'd brought with her. She moved quietly, her steps deliberate, her gaze flicking from one shelf to another, taking in the rows of books, each one stacked in its place, yet not quite offering the answers she sought. Jillian was behind the counter, he humming as she sorted through a pile of old magazines. Miss Marple knew she was being watched, but Jillian's gaze was unfocused, her attention distracted by the task at hand. That was all the better for Miss Marple. She had learned long ago that the quiet moments were the best for observation. The answers were often hidden in the smallest details. She moved to the back of the shop, where the shelves were crammed with volumes that seemed to have been here for ages. Dusty, forgotten relics. The small desk where Mr. Morgan had been sitting earlier stood just ahead, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the glint of something peeking from beneath the stack of papers. She took a step closer, her hand resting lightly on the desk, just for a moment. There, partially hidden beneath a thick leather-bound ledger, was the letter. It was unmistakable, its corner just visible beneath the clutter. Miss Marple's fingers hovered above it, her heart beating a little faster. There was no turning back now. Her fingers closed around the letter with practiced care, lifting it slowly from its hiding place. She turned it over gently, noting the slight crinkle of the paper as though it had been handled repeatedly. It wasn't just a letter, it was a key to the mystery that had been growing darker with each passing hour. She carefully slid it open, her eyes scanning the words quickly. The letter was brief, typed on a page of thick off-white paper. There were no names, no direct addresses, just a cryptic message. The bookshop holds more than just stories. You must look deeper, beyond the covers, to find the truth. But be careful, for once you know, there is no turning back. The words echoed in her mind, their meaning lingering like an ominous fog. It was as if someone had been waiting for Miss Marple to arrive at this very moment. The message was clear. Someone knew she was getting closer. But what was the truth they were warning her about? And why had the letter been hidden here? She folded the letter back with great care, slipping it into the folds of her coat. As she did, she noticed something else. A slight disturbance in the pile of books on the corner shelf. a book out of place, its cover frayed as though it had been recently pulled from the shelf and hastily returned. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The book was out of alignment with the others, a small but crucial detail. She walked over to the shelf, her fingers brushing the spines of the books as she examined them one by one. It was an old book, bound in dark leather, with gold lettering that had all but faded. She pulled it out carefully, the musty scent of old paper wafting from its pages. The History of St. Mary's Hollow, a personal account. It was the same book she had seen earlier, the one Jillian had tried to offer her. Now it seemed more important than ever. Miss Marple flipped through the pages, her gaze moving quickly over the text. At first, the words seemed harmless. Descriptions of the village's founding, its early settlers, and the simple lives of the villagers. But as she reached the later chapters, her fingers faltered. The tone shifted, becoming darker, more mysterious. There were references to secret meetings, obscure mentions of family disputes, and a veiled hint at a death. One that seemed strangely familiar. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read further, piecing together fragments of information that made her skin prickle with unease. The account spoke of an old tragedy, a long-buried secret tied to the village's past, and oddly enough, a connection to the very bookshop she now stood in. The final passage, written in a hurried hand, was the most cryptic of all. The truth is buried beneath the pages. Only the right eyes will find it, but even then some truths are best left undisturbed. Miss Marple closed the book with a snap, her thoughts racing. This was no ordinary history. This was a warning. Someone had been trying to bury the past, and Miss Marple had just uncovered the first of many pieces that would reveal its hidden face. She turned to find Jillian watching her from the counter, her expression unreadable. "Is everything all right, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice smooth, but with an edge of tension that hadn't been there before. "Quite," Miss Marple replied, offering a polite smile. "I was just admiring your collection. It's remarkable, really, how much history is hidden in these books." Jillian nodded, but Miss Marple could see the shift in her demeanour. She was no longer the kindly shopkeeper she had once appeared to be. There was something else behind her eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "I'm glad you think so," Jillian said, her voice tight, "but not all history is meant to be unearthed. Some things are better left to time." Miss Marple met her gaze steadily, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. The game was afoot, the mystery was deepening, and then Jillian's cryptic words only confirmed that there was much more at stake than anyone in the village realized. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was closer than ever, and it was only a matter of time before the shadows of the past fully revealed themselves. The rain had returned in full force by the time Miss Marple left Jillian's corner. Her mind was spinning with the revelations of the past few hours. The cryptic letter, the book with its haunting final passage, and the subtle hints of something buried deep in the village's history. It all pointed to a puzzle that was rapidly taking shape, but one that she was still only beginning to understand. She walked briskly through the village square, the cobblestones slick beneath her feet as the rain tapped against her umbrella. The streets were mostly empty now, save for the occasional figure hurrying along, their heads down against the downpour. It was as though the village had retreated into itself, hiding behind closed doors and curtained windows. The further Miss Marple walked, the more she felt the weight of the secrets pressing in around her. The letter, so carefully hidden, seemed like a message specifically for her, someone who had the patience to read between the lines, to notice what others ignored. It was clear now that whoever had left it behind in the shop had known exactly what they were doing. Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to Mr. Morgan. He had been too careful, too guarded, and his presence had felt out of place. What was he hiding? And why had he so fervently tried to cover up the letter? As she approached her cottage, Miss Marple was struck by a sudden thought. What if the young man wasn't just a stranger to the village? What if he had deeper ties, hidden connections to its past? The idea nagged at her as she climbed the small set of steps to her door. Inside, she set her umbrella down by the entrance, shaking out the water before hanging it on the stand. Her small sitting room greeted her with its usual warmth, the fire crackling in the hearth. But tonight, the familiar comfort of her cottage seemed a bit more suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She pulled out the book again, carefully flipping through its pages. The passage about the village's old tragedy still rang in her ears. The vague references, the cryptic warnings, it all pointed to something that had been hidden away for far too long. Someone had been trying to bury the past. But why? And her mind returned to the letter. The phrase, "Only the right eyes will find it," stood out, as though it had been written just for her. She wasn't sure what it meant, but it felt like an invitation to dig deeper. She sat down at her desk and pulled out her notebook, the pages now filled with her observations and theories. The details, small as they were beginning to form a pattern. The letter, the book, the strange behavior of the villagers. It was all connected. But the connection was still a mystery. There was one place in the village that Miss Marple hadn't yet visited. The old church at the edge of the square had always intrigued her, though she had never found reason to visit it in the course of her previous investigations. Today, though, it seemed like the right time, and the church had witnessed decades of village life, and its ancient walls might hold more than just prayers and sermons. Perhaps they held secrets too. By the time Miss Marple reached the church, the rain had begun to let up, the clouds parting to reveal the faintest hint of moonlight. The church tower loomed above her, the bells silent for the moment, but Miss Marple could almost hear the faint echo of their tolling. The churchyard was eerily quiet, the gravestones standing like sentinels in the dim light. She made her way to the entrance, pausing for a moment as her eyes scanned the scene. The door creaked open on its hinges, revealing the interior, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. The air was cool and musty, filled with the scent of old wood and incense. There was no one inside. Miss Marple walked slowly down the centre aisle, and her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Her eyes swept over the pews, the stained-glass windows, and the altar at the far end. Everything was as it should be, peaceful, serene, but Miss Marple could feel the weight of history pressing in on her. The church had seen it all, the births, the deaths, the marriages, and the quiet secrets buried beneath the surface. At the back of the church, just past the pulpit, there was a small door leading to the vestry. Miss Marple's curiosity piqued. She made her way toward it, her steps deliberate but silent. She reached for the handle and pushed the door open, the soft click of the latch breaking the silence. Inside, the vestry was cramped and cluttered. Books, papers, and old vestments were piled haphazardly on the shelves. But it wasn't the clutter that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the desk at the far corner. On it sat a small stack of papers, each one carefully stacked, but not yet filed. Miss Marple's fingers lingered over the pile, her heart quickening as she noticed something unusual. At the top of the stack was a letter. It wasn't the same as the one she had found earlier. It was smaller, more formal, written in a flowing script. She read the first few words aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the stillness of the room. To whom it may concern, this is to confirm that the transaction for the sale of the property at 18 High Street has been completed. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The property at 18 High Street, the bookshop. She leaned closer, her fingers trembling as she read the rest of the letter. It was a confirmation of the sale of the property, dated just a few months earlier. But there was something odd about the wording. The transaction seemed rushed, as though the buyer had been in a hurry to seal the deal. And then she saw it. A small but significant detail. The letterhead of the estate agent was not from any firm Miss Marple recognized. In fact, it was a name she had never seen before. The words Craven and Sons were neatly printed at the top, but the address was wrong. It was listed as a street she knew well, but the number and name were completely off. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the letter, her mind racing. Craven and Sons. Why had she never heard of them? Why had they been involved in the sale of the bookshop? She slipped the letter into her coat pocket and turned to leave the vestry, her mind already piecing together the threads of a much larger mystery. The bookshop, the letter, the strange agent, everything was falling into place. But the real question was, why? Miss Marple stood in the church vestry, the letter from Craven and Sons now safely tucked inside her coat. The weight of it seemed to press on her chest as she exited the room, her steps slow and measured, as if she feared disturbing the fragile thread of thought that had started to unwind in her mind. The air inside the church had felt thick with history, the shadows of the past lingering like a fog she could almost touch. She paused in the doorway, glancing back at the altar, the rows of pews bathed in dim light. There was no sign of life, no footsteps, no voices, just the heavy silence that enveloped everything. But Miss Marple knew, with a certainty that made her pulse quicken, that the stillness was deceiving. The village was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the calm. She stepped outside into the fading twilight, the rain having subsided to a gentle mist. The cobblestone path felt cooler under her feet as she made her way back toward the village square, her thoughts swirling. Craven and Sons was no name she had encountered before, and the oddness of the transaction, the rush to close the sale, the misaddressed letter, wasn't lost on her. Someone was trying to hide something. The bookshop, once a peaceful haven, was at the heart of a mystery far deeper than she had first anticipated. Her mind returned to Mr. Morgan. What role had he played in all of this? He had been so careful, so secretive. His visit to the bookshop, his quick departure, it was all starting to paint a picture, though she still didn't know what the final scene would look like. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay within the village's past. The strange book she had discovered, with its cryptic passages, and the letter from Craven and Sons. It was all connected to something buried here, something the village had long since forgotten. The tragedy mentioned in the book was no accident, nor was it a forgotten chapter of history. It was a tragedy that someone wanted to keep hidden. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, the sky had darkened and a thin fog had begun to creep through the village. She closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click, and made her way to the small desk where she had left her notes earlier. She spread them out, and the letter from the bookshop still on top, the words etched into her memory. She examined the pages once more. The bookshop sale, the hidden message in the letter, the cryptic history book. It was clear to Miss Marple that this was no ordinary case. It wasn't just about a murder or a missing piece of history. It was about a cover-up, something more personal, deeply rooted in the village itself. Her thoughts turned to the people she had met so far, the reclusive Mr. Morgan, the nervous Mrs. Henshaw, and even Jillian, who had seemed so harmless at first, but whose reaction to Miss Marple's questions had been too guarded. Could any of them be connected to the tragedy hinted at in the history book? And what had happened to the bookshop's previous owner? Had he known too much about the past, and had that knowledge led to his demise? Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of her teacup, her mind sharp as ever. The clues were still few, but they were beginning to fit together like pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. And there was one place she had yet to explore: the village archives. The village archives were housed in a small, unassuming building near the centre of the square, tucked between two shops that had long since closed for the evening. The building itself was as old as the village, its stone walls weathered and worn, the windows dim with age. The door creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open, and she was greeted by the familiar scent of dust and paper. Inside, the room was lined with shelves full of ledgers, newspapers and town records. The light was low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out of the corners of the room. A single clerk sat at the desk, bent over a stack of papers, but she looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Good evening, Miss Marple," the clerk said with a polite nod. "What can I help you with today?" "I'm looking for some old records," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm and steady. "Specifically, anything related to the village's history, the bookshop, or perhaps even the previous owner." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "You're not the first person to inquire about the bookshop recently," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "But I'm afraid our records on the property are sparse. The previous owner was a rather private man. There's not much about him in the town archives." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "Could I see what you do have?" The clerk hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, rising from her chair to retrieve a box from a nearby shelf. She set it down on the desk with a soft thud and began flipping through the papers. "There's a deed here from several years ago," she said, pulling out a single sheet of parchment. "It was signed over to Jillian, the current owner of the bookshop, but apart from that, there's not much to go on." Miss Marple took the paper, her fingers tracing the faded ink of the signature. Jillian's name was written there, plain and simple. But something about the transaction seemed off. The date was recent, but the formality of it, the lack of any additional records, there was something missing. "Could you also check for any reports of accidents or deaths in the village?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual but insistent. "Something that might have involved the bookshop or its previous owner." The clerk flipped through another few records, her fingers slowing as she scanned the pages. "There is one report," she said, her voice low. "A death a few years ago. It wasn't much of a case, just an incident on the property. But the details are vague. The report says it was an accident, but the details are very minimal." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Could I see that report?" The clerk hesitated again, but then retrieved a thin folder from the shelf and handed it over. Miss Marple opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the few short lines of text. It was indeed a minimal report, listing little more than the date and the vague mention of an accident. The name of the deceased was not even mentioned, but something caught Miss Marple's eye. A small annotation in the corner, written in a different hand. Further investigation required, but no evidence of foul play. The words sent a chill through her. There was more to this story, hidden beneath the surface. And Miss Marple was beginning to see the first real crack in the wall of secrecy. Miss Marple stood at the archives desk, the thin folder still open before her. The cryptic report of the previous owner's accidental death lingered in her mind, the words "further investigation required," echoing as if the clerk's quiet comment had been meant specifically for her. It wasn't just the report that intrigued her. It was the way it had been filed away with so little detail, as though someone had been trying to sweep it under the rug. She glanced up at the clerk, but who had returned to her paperwork. The young woman was busy but not overly engaged in her task. Miss Marple seized the moment to press a bit further. "Would you be able to tell me when this report was filed?" The clerk glanced at the folder and paused for a moment, as if trying to remember. "It was filed just over 2 years ago, around the same time the bookshop changed hands," she said, her voice light but measured. "That's about all we know. The death itself was reported as a simple mishap, nothing more, but I suppose you already know that much." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts swirling. She had been right. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. The previous owner's death had occurred just before the sale, but the details were buried so deeply that it was almost as if someone didn't want the connection to be made. Why? Of what had happened during those last months? And what had Jillian known about it? "Thank you," Miss Marple said, giving the clerk a polite smile as she closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. "This will be quite useful." She stepped out of the archives, the cool air hitting her face like a sudden rush of clarity. The fog in her mind had begun to clear, but it was being replaced with something darker. The more she learned, the more she realized that St. Mary's Hollow was not the simple, peaceful village it appeared to be. Beneath its surface, secrets lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered. As she walked back toward her cottage, her mind returned to the strange name, Craven and Sons. It was clear now that this name, the involvement of the estate agent, and the vague death report were all connected. But to what? Who would benefit from the death of the previous bookshop owner? And why had that death been dismissed as an accident when Miss Marple knew deep down that there was more to the story? Her thoughts turned again to Mr. Morgan. His nervousness had been too pronounced for it to be mere coincidence. He wasn't just an outsider, he was part of this tangled web. The question was whether he was an unwilling player or the mastermind behind it all. She needed to learn more about Craven and Sons, and the only way to do that was to go directly to the source. It was a risky move, but it seemed to be the only path left. If there was one thing Miss Marple knew, it was that the truth always had a way of revealing itself. And the more she poked around, the more it seemed to tug at her like a thread begging to be pulled. By the time Miss Marple arrived home, it was nearly dusk. The village bathed in a muted light as the last of the sun disappeared behind the hills. She lit the fire in the hearth and settled into her armchair, her thoughts still racing. The report from the archives, the letter, the cryptic message in the book, it was all leading her toward a discovery she couldn't quite yet name. but she would get there, one step at a time. As she picked up her notebook and began jotting down her thoughts, the familiar knock at her door interrupted her quiet musings. It was quick, urgent, the kind of knock that spoke of trouble. Miss Marple rose to answer it, already suspecting who it would be. She had been expecting this moment. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Henshaw standing there, her face pale and drawn, the usual gossiping spark absent from her eyes. Instead, and there was something in her expression, something like fear, that Miss Marple had not seen before. "Miss Marple?" Mrs. Henshaw said in a hushed voice, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though she expected someone to be following her. "I need to talk to you. It's about the bookshop. I think you're getting too close." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, allowing Mrs. Henshaw to continue. "I've seen things," Mrs. Henshaw whispered, stepping inside quickly when Miss Marple motioned for her. "Things I shouldn't have. And I think they're watching me." Miss Marple led her to the sitting area, where they both sat in silence for a moment. Mrs. Henshaw was clearly distressed, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. Miss Marple studied her closely, noticing the subtle signs of guilt and fear. Whatever she had seen, whatever she knew, it was weighing on her heavily. "Who is watching you?" Miss Marple asked calmly, her voice soft but firm. "And what is it that you know?" Mrs. Henshaw glanced toward the door again before leaning closer. "I saw Mr. Morgan. He was talking to someone the night before the bookshop sale went through. They weren't supposed to be there. No one was supposed to see him meeting with them. But I saw him, Miss Marple, and I heard him talking about getting rid of the evidence." She swallowed hard. "And then there was a crash. A noise from inside the shop. I didn't stay, of course, but when I went past the shop the next morning, everything seemed off." Miss Marple's mind raced. Mrs. Henshaw's words confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. There had been more to the story all along, and the bookshop wasn't just a shop. It was a place where dark things had happened, things that had been buried and left to fester. "I think you need to tell me everything you know," Miss Marple said, her voice low, her gaze unwavering. Mrs. Henshaw nodded slowly, as though weighing the decision in her mind. Then, with a deep breath, she began. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across Miss Marple's sitting room. Mrs. Henshaw had recounted her story with growing urgency, her voice trembling as she revealed what she had seen and heard. Miss Marple listened intently, her sharp mind sifting through the details, analyzing every word, every hesitation. Mrs. Henshaw had seen Mr. Morgan, there was no doubt about that. But it was the cryptic conversation about getting rid of the evidence that intrigued Miss Marple the most. Was what evidence? Was it related to the previous owner's death? Was it connected to the bookshop's secret history? And what role had Mr. Morgan played in it all? Miss Marple leaned back in her armchair, considering the implications of what Mrs. Henshaw had shared. The village had always been full of whispers, but this was different. This wasn't just gossip. This was a glimpse into something far darker, something that had been carefully hidden for years. "Do you know who he was meeting?" Miss Marple asked gently, her tone coaxing but not forceful. Mrs. Henshaw shook her head, her brow furrowed in concentration. "No, I couldn't see them clearly. But the way they spoke, the urgency, it didn't feel right. I'm afraid I wasn't brave enough to stay and hear more." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Fear was a powerful thing, and Mrs. Henshaw had acted with the caution of someone who had learned the value of staying out of trouble. But her reluctance to press further had given Miss Marple the opportunity to do what she did best: connect the dots. The meeting, the strange urgency, and the mysterious evidence all pointed towards something more sinister than a mere transaction. The bookshop, once a quiet haven for books and tea, was now at the centre of a web of secrets, lies, and possibly murder. "I believe you've given me the peace I needed," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes narrowing with determination. "You've done well, Mrs. Henshaw." The older woman sighed, a look of relief crossing her face. "I don't know if I should feel good about this, Miss Marple. It's all so troubling. I just wanted to help." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "You've already helped more than you realize. Now, I believe we must turn our attention back to the bookshop." The next morning, Miss Marple found herself once again at Jillian's corner. The bookshop looked as it always had, with its crooked sign swinging gently in the morning breeze, inviting customers inside with its promise of quiet refuge. But to Miss Marple, the shop had become something far more complex. A puzzle to be solved, and she would leave no stone unturned. She entered the shop with a purposeful step, the bell above the door jingling softly in the quiet space. Jillian was behind the counter again, this time arranging some freshly arrived books. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, offering a warm smile, though her eyes seemed slightly guarded. "Miss Marple, back again?" Jillian said, her tone polite but tinged with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "I do hope you found everything you need." "I've found much to think about, actually," Miss Marple replied, her voice light, but her eyes sharp. "I've been reflecting on the history of this place. The bookshop, you see. It holds more than just stories, doesn't it?" Jillian stiffened slightly, but only for a moment, before she regained her composure. "It's a wonderful shop," she said quickly, her smile returning. "A little bit of history in every corner." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her gaze flicking to the shelves of books. "So much history in this little village, I imagine. I wonder how much of it is known, and how much is still hidden." Jillian's smile faltered just a fraction, and Miss Marple caught it, her intuition telling her that something was amiss. She wasn't sure yet what it was, but she could feel the tension in the air. Jillian had just enough of a reaction to make Miss Marple certain of one thing: the woman was hiding something. "I've been wondering," Miss Marple continued, leaning in slightly, her voice dropping to a more conversational tone, "about the previous owner, the man who ran the shop before you took over. A quiet man, I gather. What was he like, if you don't mind my asking?" Jillian hesitated, her fingers pausing in their task. She seemed to weigh the question carefully before answering. "He was private," Jillian said, her voice steady, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. "A man of few words, but very knowledgeable about books. He took great care with the shop. I suppose you could say he was a bit of a recluse." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Reclusive, yes, but did he have many visitors? Did anyone stop by often? Perhaps a close friend, a colleague?" Jillian's eyes flickered briefly to the side, before returning to Miss Marple with a calm, almost practiced expression. "No, not really. He kept to himself mostly. No one ever stayed long. The shop was his life, and he kept it that way." A sudden thought crossed Miss Marple's mind. Was there ever a time, perhaps just before he passed, when he seemed agitated, nervous maybe. Jillian's face stiffened, her lips pressed together. It was a subtle shift, one that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but Miss Marple's sharp eye caught it immediately. Jillian was hiding something. "I'm afraid I wouldn't know anything about that," Jillian replied quickly, too quickly. "I only took over after he passed." Miss Marple studied her for a moment longer, allowing the silence to stretch between them. She could feel the weight of the conversation shifting, but there was no way to push further without tipping her hand. "Well," Miss Marple said, standing up straight and giving Jillian a smile, "I suppose I'll have to come back for the rest of the story later, but thank you for your time." As she turned to leave, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that Jillian was hiding something important. There was a nervousness in her posture, a guardedness in her words that didn't sit right. Outside, the village was quiet, the sky a deep blue as the day settled into afternoon. Miss Marple's mind churned with the information she had gathered so far, but the final pieces were still missing. What had happened to the previous owner? Why was the bookshop sold so hastily? And what exactly was Jillian's role in all of it? Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct told her that the answers lay somewhere between the walls of this quaint little bookshop. And the truth, however carefully buried, was just waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple left Jillian's corner with a new sense of determination. The conversation had yielded little in terms of direct information, but the subtle signs of avoidance in Jillian's manner were telling. The woman was hiding something, perhaps not maliciously, but definitely withholding details. That was enough for Miss Marple to know she was on the right track, and as she made her way back through the village square, her mind worked through the various pieces of the puzzle. There were still too many loose ends. The cryptic message from the bookshop's history book, the hidden letter, the vague death report, and now Jillian's nervous behavior. Each element seemed to point towards something significant, but the specifics eluded her. It was becoming clear that the truth lay in the past, something that had happened before the bookshop changed hands. There was an old tragedy, a hidden secret, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. Her thoughts turned to Mr. Morgan again. He was, without a doubt, a key player in this mystery. His sudden appearance in the village, his secrecy, and his connection to the bookshop couldn't be mere coincidence. But why had he been so desperate to keep his meeting with someone else a secret? And what role did he play in the previous owner's death? With these questions swirling in her mind, Miss Marple made a decision. It was time to pay another visit to the archives. There were still records she hadn't examined, and if there was one place in St. Mary's Hollow that held the truth, it was there. The sun was beginning to set when Miss Marple arrived at the village archives for the second time. The building was quieter than before, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the weight of history. The same clerk was at the desk, and she looked up in surprise when Miss Marple entered. "Back again, Miss Marple," the clerk said with a slight smile. "What can I help you with this time?" "I'm afraid I've missed something," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm but insistent. "You see, there's something about the previous owner of the bookshop, something I didn't quite understand before. I was wondering if you had any additional records, anything that might shed light on his death." The clerk's expression flickered for a moment, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Of course. Let me see what I can find." She stood up and moved to a back shelf, pulling down a large ledger and flipping through its pages. Ah, here we are. There was a police report filed regarding his death, though it was very brief. But there is also a record from an inquest. That might be more detailed. Miss Marple's interest piqued. An inquest. This could be the break she was looking for. Yes, please, if you could bring that to me. The clerk nodded and went to retrieve the file, returning a moment later with a large folder. She handed it over without a word, and Miss Marple immediately opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. The inquest report was dated several weeks after the previous owner's death. It was thorough, but not exhaustive. The cause of death was listed as an accident. A fall, the report stated, resulting from a mishap while cleaning the shop's upper floor. But what caught Miss Marple's eye were the notes in the margins. There were marks indicating a follow-up investigation, but no details were provided. One line in particular stood out. Unusual circumstances, no further evidence of foul play found, but further investigation recommended. Miss Marple read the line again, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Why had further investigation been recommended but not conducted? The cause of death seemed to have been ruled out quickly, but there were no conclusive details to explain why the police had been instructed to continue investigating. And why had they failed to do so? She made a note of the report number and the request for further investigation, her mind racing with possibilities. It was becoming increasingly clear that the fall had not been an accident. Someone had made sure the death was deemed accidental, but the truth lay hidden behind these vague and unexplored lines. Miss Marple closed the folder and stood up, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. It was time to confront Jillian again. But this time, Miss Marple had a different plan. The evening had fallen by the time Miss Marple returned to Jillian's corner. The bookshop was quieter than before, and the shelves casting long shadows in the dim light. Miss Marple stepped inside, her umbrella dripping with the last remnants of the rain. She could hear the faint sound of pages being turned from behind the counter, where Jillian was once again sorting through a stack of books. "Miss Marple!" Jillian greeted her, her voice smooth, but with a subtle tension beneath it. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon. I have a few more questions," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and polite. She moved closer to the counter, her eyes scanning the shop. "You see, I've been going through some of the records, and I've found something that doesn't quite add up." Jillian stiffened, but Miss Marple continued before she could respond. "According to the inquest report, the previous owner's death was ruled an accident," Miss Marple said, and her eyes fixed on Jillian's face. "But the report also mentions further investigation, though it seems that never took place. How curious, don't you think?" Jillian's hands paused in their task, her fingers gripping the book a little too tightly. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice a little too steady, a little too practiced. "It was a tragic accident, nothing more." Miss Marple studied her, her gaze unyielding. "Are you sure? Because I suspect there was more to it than a simple fall. I believe someone wanted to make sure that death was dismissed as an accident. And I think you know who that someone was." Jillian's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Miss Marple knew she was on the verge of breaking something wide open. She just needed one more piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple stood in front of Jillian's counter, watching her with quiet intensity. The air between them seemed to crackle, thick with unspoken words, as though the very walls of the bookshop were holding their breath. Jillian's face was as composed as ever. but Miss Marple could see the subtle shift in her posture. An imperceptible tightening of the shoulders, a slight tremor in her hands. It was the way someone reacts when they know they can no longer hide the truth. "You seem uneasy," Miss Marple remarked, her voice light but firm. "I wonder why." Jillian's eyes flicked briefly to the door, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, her tone just a shade too defensive. She looked down at the book in her hands, as though trying to refocus on something tangible, something familiar. "Perhaps it's the inquest report that's troubling you," Miss Marple continued, taking a step closer. "The one that mentions further investigation, but never follows through. How curious that they found no foul play. And yet, the investigation was left incomplete. Did you know about that, Jillian?" Jillian didn't reply immediately. Instead, she gave a slow, deliberate sigh, almost as though she were weighing the consequences of speaking. Finally, she placed the book she had been holding down on the counter with a soft thud, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "I didn't want it to come to this," Jillian said, her voice low and tinged with something that could almost be mistaken for regret. "But you've been poking around, Miss Marple. You're too clever for your own good. You'll find the truth sooner or later. It was always going to come out." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough she'd been waiting for. The moment when the carefully constructed web of secrets began to unravel. She remained calm, her eyes not leaving Jillian's face. "I don't want to make things difficult for anyone," Miss Marple said gently, her voice deceptively soft. "But I do think there's something you're not telling me, Jillian. Something about the previous owner. Something about why he's no longer here, and why the sale of the bookshop was so rushed." Jillian's eyes flickered momentarily to the door again, but this time she didn't look away. She took a deep breath, and in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the surface-level deflection she spoke, "His name was Thomas Cartwright," she said, the words coming out like a confession. "He wasn't just a shopkeeper. He was involved in things he shouldn't have been. And I got involved too, trying to help him, trying to make things right." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "Involved in what, exactly?" Jillian hesitated, her eyes darting to the back of the shop. The silence stretched, hanging between them like an invisible weight. Finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "There were debts," she whispered. "Thomas had made some bad choices. He got involved with people who, well, they didn't take kindly to his inability to pay back what he owed. But he was stubborn. He refused to sell the shop, refused to give in. He thought he could fix everything. And then, one night, he just fell. It wasn't an accident. I saw him, you know. I saw the blood, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't help him." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but internally she felt a shift in the case. Everything she had suspected was now falling into place. The accidental death had been no accident. It had been the culmination of a series of desperate choices, and Thomas Cartwright had paid the price. "And the people he owed?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but piercing. "Who were they?" Jillian's face tightened, her eyes filling with an emotion that bordered on panic. She opened her mouth to speak but seemed to think better of it, clamping her lips shut. The silence was heavy, and for a moment Miss Marple wondered if she would get any further answers. Finally, Jillian exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging with resignation. "I don't know their names," she said quietly, I never saw their faces, but I know they had connections, people in high places, people who wanted things kept quiet. And when Thomas died, they made sure everything went smoothly. The sale of the shop, the inquest, everything was wrapped up neatly with no questions asked. They told me to keep my mouth shut, and I did. Miss Marple absorbed the information with a sense of calm clarity. It was becoming more apparent that the bookshop wasn't just a casualty of a failed business. It was part of something much larger, something deeper than a simple transaction of ownership. Thomas Cartwright had been a pawn in a dangerous game, and his death had been covered up to protect those who had used him. "But you're not keeping quiet any more," Miss Marple said softly, her voice tinged with understanding. "Why tell me now?" Jillian's eyes met hers, filled with a mix of fear and regret. "Because I can't live with it any more," she confessed. "I didn't want to be part of it, Miss Marple. I never wanted any of this, but now that you're digging, I know the truth can't stay hidden forever. I just hope it's not too late." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Miss Marple's thoughts raced as she processed everything. There were still many unanswered questions, but one thing was clear now. Thomas Cartwright's death was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. "Thank you, Jillian. You've helped more than you realize." Jillian's shoulders slumped in relief, and Miss Marple turned to leave. The moment had come. There was no more time to waste. She knew where she needed to go next. The final thread was within reach, and Miss Marple was determined to pull it until everything came undone. The night was colder than Miss Marple had expected, a chill that seemed to seep through her coat and settle in her bones as she made her way down the village lanes. The quiet was unnerving. There was no sound of chatter or movement from the cottages, only the faint rustle of the trees in the breeze. The village, once peaceful and welcoming, now felt like a place on the edge of something unseen, something hidden. And Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover a truth far darker than she had imagined. The thread she had been following was nearly at its end. Jillian's confession had provided the last piece of the puzzle, although it had raised more questions than it had answered. The secret of the previous owner's death was no longer a mystery. It was clear now that Thomas Cartwright's death had been a murder, covered up by people who had used the bookshop and the village itself as a front for something more dangerous. But who were these people? And what exactly had Cartwright been involved in? Miss Marple knew the answer was somewhere in the village, buried deep in its past. There was only one place left to look: the old house at the edge of town. It had stood empty for years, its windows dark and brooding, a decaying reminder of a time long past. Yet Miss Marple had always suspected that there was something more to it. It was the one place she had yet to explore fully, and now, with everything she had learned, she was certain it held the final piece of the puzzle. The house loomed before her as she stepped through the overgrown gate, the iron bars cold and unforgiving. The garden was wild, untended, its once pristine flower beds now a tangle of weeds and vines. The house itself was a relic, its stone walls covered in ivy, the roof sagging in places. But to Miss Marple, it was more than just a building. It was a symbol of the secret the village had tried so hard to bury. As she approached the door, she hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing on her. But there was no turning back now. She pushed open the heavy door, the creak of the hinges loud in the stillness of the night. The smell of damp wood and stale air greeted her as she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The interior was dark, and the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the broken windows. Dust hung thick in the air, and Miss Marple could barely make out the shapes of old furniture and discarded belongings scattered throughout the rooms. It was as though the house had been abandoned in a hurry. The lives once lived here, now long forgotten. But Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, and she knew what to look for. As she moved through the house, her fingers brushed over the walls, searching for any clue that might be hidden in the shadows. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, she saw it. A small, hidden door, barely noticeable beneath the layers of grime and dust. She approached it cautiously, her hand reaching for the doorknob. The door creaked open, with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the house, and Miss Marple stepped inside. The room beyond was small, its walls lined with old filing cabinets and wooden shelves, all crammed with papers and boxes. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and aged paper, but Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on one particular object in the centre of the room. A wooden desk, its surface cluttered with old documents, but at its heart a single file stood out, larger than the others, its contents more worn and handled. Miss Marple moved toward the desk, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled the file from its place. She opened it carefully, her heart quickening as she scanned the pages within. There were records here, official documents, papers that had been carefully hidden away for years. But it wasn't just the documents themselves that intrigued her. It was the names listed within them. Among the records of village transactions, property deeds, and financial statements, Miss Marple found one name repeated more than once: Craven and Sons. The realization hit her like a sudden gust of wind. Craven and Sons weren't just involved in the sale of the bookshop. They were the key players in something far more sinister. These documents detailed financial transactions, deals made in the shadows, and an entire network of people tied to the village's secret history. Miss Marple skimmed through the papers, piecing together the fragments. Craven and Sons had been more than just an estate agency. They had been laundering money, masking criminal activities, and using the bookshop as a front for their operations. Thomas Cartwright had been a pawn in their game, but when he had started asking too many questions, they had silenced him. Her hands shook as she turned the page, revealing a letter dated just weeks before Cartwright's death. It was a direct threat, a warning to stop digging, to stop asking questions. It was clear now. Cartwright had been murdered because he had stumbled upon something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Suddenly, Miss Marple heard the sound of footsteps behind her, sharp and deliberate. She spun around, her heart racing, and found herself face to face with the last person she expected to see. "Jillian, I thought you might come here," Jillian said, her voice cold and resigned. "I should have known. You're too clever for your own good, Miss Marple." Miss Marple stood her ground, her eyes never leaving Jillian's face. "I know what you've been hiding," she said quietly. "You're part of it, aren't you, Craven and Sons? You were involved in Thomas Cartwright's death." Jillian's face was pale, her eyes distant. It was supposed to be a clean job. No one was supposed to get hurt. But when he started asking questions, I knew things were getting out of control. I tried to stop it, but it was too late. They'd already made up their minds. "You didn't stop it," Miss Marple replied softly. "You helped them." Jillian's gaze flickered for a moment, her expression flickering between guilt and something colder. "I didn't have a choice. You don't know what it's like to be in their grip. I did what I had to do to survive. I never wanted this." "I don't believe you," Miss Marple said firmly. "You could have stopped this. You could have come forward. But instead, you buried the truth and let Cartwright's death be covered up." There was a long silence between them, and the weight of Miss Marple's words hanging in the air. Finally, Jillian spoke, her voice low. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but I'm done. I can't protect them any more." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then it's time for the truth to come to light." The tension between Miss Marple and Jillian hung thick in the air, like the final moments before a storm breaks. Miss Marple stood motionless, the file still clutched in her hand, its contents now seared into her memory. She could see the truth now, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. The bookshop, the hidden threats, the murder of Thomas Cartwright, it was all part of a much larger, far more dangerous game than anyone in the village had ever known. Jillian's shoulders sagged, as though a weight had been lifted, and for the first time her guarded expression seemed to crack, and she met Miss Marple's gaze, her eyes filled with an unmistakable sorrow. But there was also a flicker of relief. She had been holding the truth inside for too long, and now, with the final push from Miss Marple, it seemed as though the dam had broken. "I'm sorry," Jillian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to be a part of it, but they told me I had no choice. The moment I took over the bookshop, I became tangled in something I couldn't escape." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't have to be a part of it. You could have walked away, but you chose to stay. And in doing so, you became complicit in something much darker." Jillian's breath caught in her throat. "I never wanted Cartwright dead," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought I could control it. When he found out what they were really doing, when he started questioning everything, they decided to silence him. I thought if I just kept my head down, stayed out of the way, they'd leave me alone. But I was wrong." Miss Marple stepped forward, placing the file on the desk between them. "You're not the only one responsible for Cartwright's death, Jillian. There are others involved. Craven and Sons, the mysterious people behind the bookshop sale. They were laundering money, hiding illicit dealings right under the village's nose. They used the bookshop as a front. But Cartwright wasn't just a casualty of business. He was a victim of greed and corruption. And they knew what had to be done to cover it up." Jillian's eyes darkened, her hands trembling as she reached for the edge of the desk for support. I never knew it would go this far. I never thought they'd kill him." Miss Marple's voice softened. "They didn't just kill him, Jillian. They took everything from him. His life, his dignity, his right to know the truth. And they made sure no one would ask questions. But now, it's time for that truth to come out." A silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the revelation. Jillian seemed to crumple under the realization of what had happened. Her face twisted with regret, her eyes finally brimming with tears. "I should have told someone," she whispered. "I should have told the police, the village, someone. But I was too scared. I thought I was protecting myself. But now—" Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You weren't the only one scared, Jillian. But now it's time to end the silence." It was later that evening when Miss Marple returned to the village square, her mind still heavy with the weight of everything that had been uncovered. The sky had darkened completely. the stars hidden behind a blanket of clouds. The village was still and quiet, as though it, too, was holding its breath, waiting for the final pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. She arrived at the small police station, a modest building at the edge of the square, its windows glowing warmly in the dark. Inside, the constable was at his desk, his eyes sharp as he looked up at her approach. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a polite nod. "I didn't expect to see you here again so soon." "I have something you need to see," Miss Marple said, her voice steady and confident. "A piece of evidence that will help bring this case to a close." She placed the file she had obtained from the archives on the desk before him, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "This," she said softly, "contains the full details of the inquest into Thomas Cartwright's death, the one they tried to cover up. But it's more than that. This file contains the connections to Craven and Sons, the real story behind the bookshop, the murder, and the people who were pulling the strings, the ones who used Thomas Cartwright to further their own criminal activities." The constable's brow furrowed as he opened the file and began to read. Miss Marple remained silent, watching him as he absorbed the information. The truth was finally in front of him, undeniable and clear. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered, were now arranged in perfect order. "Ah, I see," the constable said after a long moment, his voice filled with quiet understanding. "I'll get this to the inspector immediately. This is exactly what we needed. We'll investigate Craven and Sons and the people behind this. There will be no more cover-ups." Miss Marple gave him a nod, her gaze unwavering. "Good. The truth has a way of finding its way out, no matter how hard people try to bury it, but now the village can begin to heal." It was several weeks later when the investigation finally came to a close. Craven and Sons were exposed for their involvement in money laundering, fraud, and the murder of Thomas Cartwright. The authorities arrested those responsible, including the people behind the estate agency who had used the bookshop as a front for their illegal activities. The village, though shaken, began to move forward, and the dark secrets that had been buried beneath the surface for so long were finally brought into the light, and with them came a sense of closure for those who had been affected. As for Jillian, she was allowed to walk free, but the guilt of her complicity would remain with her. She had made mistakes, but she had also found the courage to come forward when it mattered most. Miss Marple returned to her quiet life in the village, the case now closed and the mystery solved. The bookshop remained, its shelves still filled with stories, but now the story of the village, its secrets, its betrayals, and its redemption had been told. And as Miss Marple sat in her cottage one evening, sipping tea by the fire, she knew that no matter how dark the secrets, the truth would always find its way to the surface. It was only a matter of time,